Good evening. The day's news is dominated by two war stories. In the Middle East, U.S. planes again attacked Libyan boats and a missile site, although there were no fresh attacks by the Libyans. In Central America, U.S. planes moved Honduran troops into the fight against Nicaraguan forces as President Reagan authorized $20 million in emergency military help for Honduras. We will have all the details in our news summary in a moment. Charlene Hunter-Gault is in Washington tonight. Charlene?
Following the news summary, we'll be devoting all of the news hour tonight to what's going on with Libya and Honduras. On the Libya-U.S. front, a retired admiral and a military expert give us two different assessments of U.S. actions and alternatives. And we cover the Honduran-Nicaraguan front with a top U.S. diplomatic correspondent, a key Nicaraguan official, and two congressmen from opposite sides.
Funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T. Whether it's telephones, information systems, long-distance services, or computers, AT&T. Funding also is provided by this station and other public television stations, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
The United States is involved in two hot military situations tonight. In the Mediterranean, it's the U.S. versus Libya. In Honduras, the U.S. versus Nicaragua. The Libyan crisis produced more attacks against Libyan forces and an embarrassment for the U.S. Pentagon officials in Washington this morning said U.S. planes attacked a Libyan missile site for the second time and attacked and damaged two more Libyan patrol boats. The officials said it was because Libya had fired 6 more anti-aircraft missiles at U.S. planes, bringing the total since yesterday to 12. But later, White House spokesman Larry Speakes and the Pentagon said that was a mistake. Libya had not fired any shots at any American targets today, and the second wave of retaliation was still for yesterday's 6. By mid-morning, the situation in the Gulf was described as generally calm, and Secretary of Defense Weinberger said the United States would continue its exercises as planned.
Our activity is continuing. The exercises above and below and around the 32-30 line, and we'll continue to do that during the course of the exercise until the various exercises are completed.
Secretary of State Schultz had some words for Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. They were spoken in Ankara, Turkey, where he was visiting with government leaders. He said the U.S. would be on guard against Gaddafi's threat to retaliate through terrorism. Schultz added this.
Libya has threatened us on many occasions, not only us, but many others. And we have been very clear about our view that Libya harbors terrorists, trains terrorists, provides materiel for terrorists. So it is a country, unfortunately, that is part of the terrorist camp in this world.
Back in Washington, State Department spokesman talked of warnings to U.S. embassies throughout the world.
Our embassies were fully informed of our intent to conduct the freedom of navigation exercises. Embassies in the area took all prudent precautions. In light of subsequent developments, it's safe to assume that they are continuing these precautions. Primary responsibility for the safety of these missions rests with the host governments, and we have every expectation that they will meet this responsibility.
Reaction on Capitol Hill was generally supportive of U.S. actions against Libya. Senate Republican leader Robert Dole said, on this issue, Americans are united, Democrats and Republicans alike. From now on, if Gaddafi wants to play, he will pay. Senate Democratic leader Robert Byrd defended the U.S.'s right and duty to withstand attacks. But Congressman Dante Fascell, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, charged that the president may have violated the 1973 War Powers Act, which requires the president to notify Congress when U.S. forces face potential combat.
We took the trouble to notify our allies, took the trouble to notify the Soviets. So everybody was informed. The media, of course, was right there carrying the story, but not the Congress. And this has been a constant complaint in the Congress, that we're always brought in after the fact, in an official sense. Of course we watch TV and read the print media, but that's no substitute for direct consultation, negotiation, and advice with the President of the United States as he carries out his constitutional responsibilities.
And following a briefing on events in Libya, Congresswoman Pat Schroeder, a Democrat from Colorado, said she was worried about more than the War Powers Act.
The question is if we're just going to sit there with three battle groups, at what point does it look more confrontational than just the exercise of showing the free seas? And that's the real question that I leave in my mind, and it was not answered by the briefing.
International reaction to the U.S. attack was also mixed. The greatest support for the U.S. came from Israel and Britain. Other Western European countries warned against escalating the conflict. The Soviet Union accused the U.S. of deliberately provoking Libya and joined most of the Arab world in resolutely condemning the actions. In the Libyan capital of Tripoli, thousands of angry demonstrators marched through the streets. For more on that and other Arab reaction, we have a report from Roderick Pratt of Worldwide Television News.
Libyan television showed an angry popular reaction. Thousands of anti-American demonstrators filled the streets of Tripoli and Benghazi, demanding the destruction of the U.S. Sixth Fleet. Gaddafi himself looks and sounds determined. He'd earlier addressed his people saying Libya would continue to fight for the sake of the entire Arab nation. Americans would cross his line of death at their peril. In Tunis, the 21-nation Arab League agreed to consider Libyan complaints of flagrant American aggression. But sources close to the Arab foreign ministers refused to speculate on what practical support the organization would be prepared to give.
The second war front of the day was in Honduras, where U.S. planes began airlifting Honduran troops into action against Nicaraguan forces. It followed the decision of President Reagan to provide $20 million worth of emergency military assistance to the Hondurans. They asked for the help in repelling what they said was a 1,500-man Nicaraguan invasion force that came to attack bases of the U.S.-supported anti-Sandinista Contra guerrillas. Nicaragua has denied everything. A spokesman at the Nicaraguan embassy in Washington said the incursion charge was a complete fabrication. But he said there were constant armed clashes along the border between the two countries because the Contras use Honduran bases for their operations against Nicaragua.
Top House Democrats, who last week led the fight against President Reagan's $100 million Contra aid package, were highly critical of the Nicaraguan action. Speaker Thomas Tip O'Neill said the Nicaraguan military action was a tremendous blunder and an aggression by a nation into another nation. He was joined in his criticism by House Democratic leader Jim Wright, who also said the Contra aid issue would be reconsidered by the House. A Senate vote on the Contra aid request is scheduled for Thursday.
And finally in the news today, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the right of the U.S. military to uphold its dress codes. It ruled in a 5-4 vote the Air Force could ban the wearing of a Jewish cap called a yarmulke by personnel in uniform. An Orthodox Jewish rabbi, now a former Air Force captain, had sued on grounds such a rule violated his constitutional rights.
Still to come on the NewsHour, 2 military assessments of U.S. actions and alternatives in Libya, and a top diplomatic correspondent, a key Nicaraguan official, and 2 congressmen react to U.S. actions in Honduras.
The Libyan crisis got both better and worse today. The U.S. fired more shots in anger, attacking a missile site for the second time and hitting 2 more Libyan patrol boats. But Libya did not fire back. There was some initial confusion about it, but U.S. officials finally said Libya took no aggressive actions against U.S. forces today. A brief reminder of the background and the backdrop behind this confrontation. Libya is a nation of 4 million people located at the south end of the Mediterranean Sea, some 250 miles south of Italy and Greece. Libyan leader Gaddafi has drawn an imaginary line across the Gulf of Sidra and declared everything south Libyan waters, at its most distant point some 120 miles from Libyan land. The U.S. says that is nonsense and says only the regular, internationally accepted 12-mile limit applies. To make the point, the U.S. moved elements of the Sixth Fleet into the area Sunday in what was called a freedom of navigation exercise. Gaddafi's line of death was then crossed. Anti-aircraft missiles were fired at U.S. planes from a missile site near the town of Sidra. In retaliation, U.S. planes attacked and damaged 5 Libyan patrol boats and bombed the Sidra missile site twice, late yesterday and then again this morning. But it really began 3 months ago when Palestinian terrorists attacked the Rome and Vienna airports. 20 people died, 5 of them were Americans, including an 11-year-old girl. The State Department accused Libya of harboring the terrorists.
Libya has applauded the attacks at Rome and Vienna airports, calling them, according to their own news agency, heroic actions. We believe Gaddafi has given Abu Nidal, his group, a considerable amount of financing and assistance.
Responding to the U.S. accusations, Gaddafi placed his country's armed forces on maximum alert, saying any aggression on Libya meant war. Gaddafi's rhetoric inspired massive street demonstrations in Tripoli in support of his hardline posture. A few days later, on January 7th, President Reagan ordered all American citizens to leave Libya, froze Libyan assets in the United States, and imposed economic sanctions against Libya.
We've taken these steps after much reflection and in full awareness of the economic consequences which the United States stands to incur as a result. Civilized nations cannot continue to tolerate, in the name of material gain and self-interest, the murder of innocents. Gaddafi deserves to be treated as a pariah in the world community.
At about the same time, the U.S. started a series of major military exercises in the Mediterranean off the coast of Libya. These exercises, according to the State Department, were designed as a show of force. It was during these exercises that Gaddafi drew his so-called line of death across the outer edge of the Gulf of Sidra, vowing to attack any U.S. ships which crossed that line. He personally boarded a patrol boat and sailed into the Gulf, vowing to confront the Sixth Fleet. And that brings us back to today, and again to Bill Beecher, the Boston Globe's chief diplomatic correspondent, was here last night to help us sort through the day's events. He did so well, we invited him back tonight. Bill, 2 more patrol boats were hit today, is that right? And the Sidra missile site again?
That does appear to be the case, yes.
Do we know?
One of those boats, however, might have been hit yesterday, limped into Benghazi, came back out, and was destroyed.
Any word on details as far as damage to the missile site?
No, it seems to be very difficult to get that kind of finite information from a distance.
Yeah. Okay, now what prompted the attacks today? And putting it all together, I know there was some confusion this morning, but looking back now, what's the best word on what happened today?
Well, on the missile boats, the announcement from the White House yesterday made the point that any movement forward toward the fleet by any aircraft or combat vessels would be considered hostile without any further specific act on the part of the Libyan forces, and appropriate action would be taken. That seems to be the explanation for what the attack on 2 missile boats. In terms of the SAM-5 site at Sirte, what the Pentagon said is they turned on their radar, and that was considered sufficient provocation to attack that radar.
Yeah. What's the story behind the confusion this morning about the original announcement that 6 more missiles had been fired at U.S. planes, bringing the total to 12, and then the latest said, no, that was wrong. There'd only been 6 and none had been fired today. What's behind all of that? Do you know?
My own personal experience in this sort of thing is that in a crisis, about half of the initial reporting is wrong. It's very difficult through the reporting chain to get accurate information on these kinds of things. That's been shown repeatedly, and I guess that's been evidenced again today.
Mm-hmm. But the original characterization of today's action being a retaliation for the second 6 just fell by the wayside as a result, correct?
That seems to be the case, yes.
Yeah.
They're not sure how many SAM-5s were fired. Certainly at least 6, they say, possibly as many as 8, not 12.
But the situation remains the same as it was this time last night when we were talking. There are no reports of any U.S. casualties or damage to any kind of any airplanes or ships or anything, correct?
What is perhaps more interesting, to me at least, is that if Colonel Gaddafi decides to back off, or rather not to take any provocative actions, and if that goes on for 2-3 days, officials privately say the U.S. would then be prepared to move out of the Gulf of Sidra, say they've made their point, and the operation is concluded.
I see. But as it stands tonight, there's no decision to move him before 2 or 3 days. In other words, they're going to give him another 2 or 3 days to see if he reacts, correct?
I don't have that kind of precise information
Sure.
from policymakers, but the information I get is that if it's calm for 2 or 3 days, days. And the U.S. is prepared to end the operation early, before the April 1st date that was originally cited.
What kind of interpretation is being put on the fact that Gaddafi did not take any overt acts against U.S. forces today?
Confusion. No one knows for sure. His aircraft probably have not ventured out over the Gulf. Their flying has been over land, their own land space is probably prudent. With that kind of force in the area, they would probably lose a lot of aircraft very, very quickly. And that would not serve any of Gaddafi's purposes. But why he's not doing anything further in the way of using the submarines, for example, that he has, making more of an effort with his missile boats, or using terrorism outside the immediate zone of contention is the interesting question. I don't have the answer to it.
Yeah. Is there a feeling on your part that this thing may be over now for all practical purposes, that the U.S. will sit there for another 2 or 3 days and then say we won and pull out?
That's the hope of a lot of people, yes.
Yeah, okay. Bill, thank you. And don't go away, because we'll be back to you later. The wisdom and the risks involved in what the U.S. is doing in the Gulf of Sidra is where we go now with two military experts who see it very differently. They are retired Admiral Jean LaROCQUE, Director of the Center for Defense Information, a Washington think tank, and Edward LUTTWAK, Senior Fellow in Strategic Studies at the Georgetown University Center for Strategic and International Studies. He has been a consultant to both the Defense and State Departments. Admiral LaROCQUE, what do you think of the U.S. actions in this Libyan affair?
Well, I think very, very clearly we've given the Sixth Fleet an impossible mission, a mission impossible. We've told the Sixth Fleet to go into that area and see if we can't persuade Gaddafi to stop claiming the Gulf of Sidra as his property. And no way is Gaddafi going to do that. Secondly, we've said to them, we want you to go in there and hammer Gaddafi to the point that he says, I give up supporting terrorism around the world. No matter how much we bomb him, Gaddafi is not going to give up terrorism around the world. In fact, I would even argue that our attacks now on the mainland, the homeland of Libya, will increase the likelihood of terrorist actions against the U.S. Then the other thing we've really said to the Sixth Fleet was, go in there and make a fool out of this fella Gaddafi. If he comes out, shoot anything he sends at you, because we want to put him down in the eyes of the world. On the contrary, I think, particularly among the Arab world, Gaddafi is going to be a hero, and we are going to come off looking like something of a bully. This guy Gaddafi is crazy, and you can't beat him by knocking out a few of his patrol craft and shooting down a few of his planes. So I think we've given an impossible job. You mentioned that the Sixth Fleet would pull out and say, we won. Gaddafi is the guy that's going to say we won. He's going to claim he shot down 3 of our planes, which we know is not true. And he's going to come off as having been a great hero to stand up to the United States. So I would say the whole effort was counterproductive.
Dr. LUTTWAK, do you agree with that?
Well, the implication from what we just heard is that there were better choices. Actually, once Gaddafi drew his line of death across the Gulf of Sirte and said and claimed ownership over the open sea, the United States, as the leading naval power, the power which has really taken over the British role of assuring freedom of navigation, had no choice but to try and reclaim that sea for free navigation everywhere. Let me just say that in the last few months, since the famous Gaddafi proclamation, our allies and friends, these countries that allow our ships to visit their ports, and have been saying to us, well, when are you going to do something about it? This has always been a role for the leading naval power, and it's not a role that one can run away from, because countries will not be willing to extend their facilities to the United States and its Navy if that Navy doesn't perform the power. So perhaps Admiral LaROCQUE is right that there will be very heavy costs from this. I think what he misses is that there would have been very heavy costs from not trying it.
And what would those costs have been?
The cost would have been to undermine credibility, not in some public relations sense, some empty prestige, but in a very specific sense of tomorrow us going to, let's say, the Spanish or the Italians or wherever, and saying, look, we need this and that facility for our general strategic need, and they're reacting to us not as the leading naval power, which is performing on their behalf the task of maintaining navigation, not merely in the Mediterranean, but let's say in the Philippine Sea, anywhere in the world. Instead, they'll treated us as a country that, when it came its turn to do the job, wouldn't do the job.
Jim?
Admiral?
Now, let me just say, there's one thing I am worried about. And there's something in what the Admiral said that there's a lot of sense in. And that is that one cannot just now walk away from the situation. You can't just pull back the 3 carriers and say, proclaim yourself as victorious or happy or whatever. Because this is a war in the sense that a move triggers a counter-move. And this is a war in the sense that it cannot just be suspended. It must be ended, either by much more action against Libya, much more, or by negotiating an agreement. It doesn't have to be a formal treaty, but it has to be at least a ceasefire, because otherwise the 3 carriers leave. Tomorrow, an American oiler or even a commercial ship passes by. The same missile boats that will fail to sink a carrier battle group can go out there and sink it. Or an American transport aircraft flies, and the same SAM-5 that will not succeed in shooting down a very agile naval fighter will be able to shoot down a transport of ours flying across. So one cannot suspend this. In this sense, it is in fact a war.
You
Jim,
agree? Yes, Admiral, go ahead.
I think it's important, too, to look at this on the timing. Why now? The Libyans have had this claim to the Gulf of Sidra since 1971, about 15 years. Why have we picked on this now to make an issue of it? I think there is a question in my mind as to whether or not the President is not trying to dramatize his need for additional monies for the Defense Department budget.
Excuse me, I really think this is...
And secondly, I think that the interesting thing that's happening, I think, on this issue today is I've not heard from President Reagan. He's not been out explaining this to us at all, and he's the guy that is the commander-in-chief of this, and I'd really like to hear from him.
May I say something? I think this is really unkind and I think misleading. We have Bill Beecher here, who probably fill us in on all the details, but I think everybody knows that ever since the Libyan supported, at least, terrorist attacks in Rome and Vienna, ever since Gaddafi's proclamation of this line of death, there has been a very serious debate inside the United States government between those who believed that the time had come to really try and remove Gaddafi by main force and those that were reluctant to act in any way. There's been a lot of deliberation, obviously a lot of planning, and the result was, I think, was a very measured compromise, that we would try to do nothing specific about the terrorism, but we would try and reclaim the freedom of navigation. A very measured compromise. To say that this is linked to the defense budget debate, I think it's really it's unkind and inappropriate and unworthy, because it was really a policy effort and a policy discussion done in very general terms about the meaning of power and the meaning of responsibility.
Admiral, what you do not feel that this is in any way linked to a U.S. response against the alleged terrorist acts of Libya?
Of course, I think that's one of the prime motivations. We hate this guy Gaddafi with good cause. But if we're going to take him out, as Mr. LUTTWAK suggests, this is simply not the way to do it. We've strengthened his position. We've given him some status in the world. We haven't taken him out. We've enhanced his position.
Well, political compromises that yield answers about what the United States can do politically need not correspond with a very effective strategic result. The political compromise inside the government, but really inside, I think, all our public opinion, is that on the one hand we don't like Gaddafi, on the other we are not willing, apparently, to take on a real war, to knock him out. Hence this compromise move, which can be criticized as being a half measure, and I accept that. But I think one should not see it as a low political maneuver designed to get money for the defense budget. I really don't think that these people in the government would in fact be risking lives on that basis.
Let's ask Bill Beecher about that. Bill, you've been listening to this. What can you add or subtract from, as far as the motivations are concerned, about why the U.S. did what it did?
You're asking me to be a referee here, Jim.
Well, I'm asking you to play any role you'd like to play.
In fact, I tend to side somewhat with Ed LUTTWAK on this particular issue. I think the larger objective was to try to put sufficient fright into Colonel Gaddafi about the willingness of the United States to apply awesome military power, but to do so in a measured way, hoping that that would be enough, that he'd get the point, and that he'd reconsider his support for terrorism. Yeah. There was a major debate on the subject. This thing has not played out entirely. The decision-making is a dynamic process. It doesn't end on a day there's a television show discussing a particular action, and it is not yet decided. And in fact, the operation in Sidra may go one of two ways. If Colonel Gaddafi decides in the area to do some major military things, or say to kill some Americans at an airport, at an embassy, my own suspicion is that those who have been arguing inside the government for a major application of force against Libyan targets throughout Libya, and not just a scattered target here or there, will then prevail, and we will then see that played out.
Does that make sense to you, Admiral LaROCQUE?
Sure, I think that it makes a good deal of sense. But if we're going to say, as Mr. Beecher does, that we've sent the forces in to do battle with Gaddafi, and that we still haven't made up our minds yet as to what it is we want to do, then there's something very faulty with our system. When the decision is made, when you send American forces to kill people in another country and hazard your own young men and hazard your naval vessels in a situation there, you've made a real huge decision to go on a certain course. And I would say that we have simply not thought through what it is we're trying to accomplish with this huge show of military force and action in the Gulf of Sidra.
The world, I think, is saying rather that we have taken our own sweet time about thinking it through. The attacks in Rome, Vienna took place 90 days ago. Gaddafi's assertion of the line of death was 3 months ago. And 3 months, I think, have been spent in deliberation. Indeed, it may be criticized this overlong deliberation, yielding to the assembly of a really huge force, perhaps unnecessarily large for this kind of action. Can I just comment briefly on this notion that Gaddafi can now respond at will by unleashing terrorists? I think that the evidence shows that Gaddafi has been trying to launch or sponsor terrorist actions for many years. His problem is that it's so difficult for Gaddafi to get a hold of competent terrorists who are capable of just going through a passport control, making a meet, picking up a weapon, finding a target, carrying it out, and also willing to do it. And whenever Abu Nidal or somebody shows up with half-competent terrorists, he always sponsors them. If he wishes to respond by terrorism this time, he'll have great difficulty. It'll take him weeks and months before something can be organized. So we should definitely not expect an immediate response.
Well, obviously the State Department and our government is taking a different view of it. We've alerted all of our embassies and consulates all over the world to stand by for a counterattack from Gaddafi. We've increased the security for some of our top people here in Washington. I think we know full well that Gaddafi is going to sponsor some form of terrorism. It may be limited. He may not have competent terrorists, but he's going to have people wanting to give their lives for their cause.
Yes, but the point I like to emphasize is that he's been trying to do it for years, and he has given us as much terrorism as he could. So whatever we may think of what happened in the Gulf of Sirte, I don't think it's valid to criticize it by saying that it will cause more terrorism.
All right, gentlemen, we have to leave it there for now. Thank you both very much.